Why do we call the period of history we're studying in medieval Europe the Dark Ages? Because it was the night time. um, I was on a date once and I got to choose where we went to dinner. And I told the girl that we were going to have dinner with a medieval ruler of Germany. And she was like, huh? And I was like, you'll see. So we got in the car and I drove her to Burger King. So good. So good. All right. Last one. I recently tried searching the internet for a medieval servant boy, but I kept getting the same error. It said, page not found. All right. Um, so if you look at the slides, we are on slide 10 of 20 right now. We just finished talking about European geography. And slides 10 and 11 and 12, basically, a lot of the slides are going to seem like they cover material that we've already discussed before. Um, and the reason for that is, what was that? It was like a beetle. A beetle just flew right by my head. Okay. Anyways, that's funny. My dog's all agitated now. She saw me freak out and was like, "What's going on? He's normally so stoic and strong." All right. So yeah, we're repeating a lot of information that I covered in previous slides, but that's because the way I set up the slideshow for this chapter, I laid out a lot of information in the beginning and didn't really go into a lot of detail. And so now we need to circle back to it and go into some more detail about Charles Martel, about Charlemagne, about the spread of Christianity in Europe, talk about why it matters. All right, so you'll remember that Charles Martel is the first Frankish leader who starts to put Europe back together after the fall of the Roman Empire. So when the Roman Empire collapsed, Europe and Rome's control over it collapsed with it, right? And so it's kind of like Europe broke into 1,000 different pieces. And a lot of kingdoms popped up, a lot of native European tribes, barbarian tribes, took hold of vast swaths of land. But it's not like it's not like Rome's influence on Europe just totally evaporated, right? A lot of pieces of the Roman civilization actually survived and continued in Europe. So, for example, the Latin language is something that survived. People continued to write and read and speak in the Latin language. People continued the practice of Roman art forms, right? So this image right here on slide 10 is an image of the Battle of Tours. And you'll notice that it's kind of a blend of what we would think of as medieval art because it shows a battle and all these soldiers in armor. But it's done in kind of a Roman style, right? So the style of Roman art remained. Of course, Rome was known for its vast road system throughout the world. So Rome's roads and water systems continued to be used, of course, for travel, for trade. And of course, Christianity continued to grow in Europe as well. Right? So we learned about Sorry, I just got a remind message from someone. Okay, yes. Uh, we learned about the Frankish tribe. The Franks were a native Germanic tribe, and they were probably the most powerful force in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. And the Franks formed a lot of small kingdoms inside of Europe. And uh, in the 700s, there was a Frankish leader named Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer. You'll remember our discussion of Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours, right? So Charles Martel is responsible for basically preserving Christianity inside of Europe, right? Because at this time, Muslim forces were starting to spread across the Middle East. They were coming up from North Africa. They were coming through the Iberian Peninsula, and they're making their presence known in Central Europe, right? So Charles Martel, a Christian, wants to stop the spread of Islam in Europe. So he leads his Christian army to victory in the very famous Battle of Tours, which permanently drove Islamic forces out of Europe, and ensured that Europe would remain Christian for the remainder of its existence. Now, it's important to note that Islam still remained very popular in Spain, but the rest of Europe had largely rejected Islam and was Christian. Then, of course, we also learned about Charles Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, who's probably one of the top 5 most important people in all of medieval Europe. Charlemagne was important to Europe for 2 reasons. Number one, he created the idea of the European king, which was something that the world had never seen before. And I'll get to what that means in a second. And number two, he basically created a relationship between Europe and the Catholic Church that still exists even to this very day. All right. So first, we'll talk about what Charlemagne did for kingship. Right. So as we learned in the last slide, the way Charlemagne became king is he basically got the approval of the Pope and formed quasi-alliance with the Catholic Church, and that established a precedent that in order to show that he was legitimate, when a king was crowned, he would get the approval of the Catholic Church, the Pope, if he could. So what did Charlemagne do? Well, he created the idea of kingship as both the head of the government, but also the entire society, right? And so Charlemagne was the first king to say, all right, not only am I in charge of the military and collecting taxes and the law and the court system and the economy, I'm also in charge of the entire society, right? So this dramatically expands the power of the king, and it makes sense that if he wants to claim that he's in charge of the entire society, he would need to have some sort of divine sanction, or at least the approval of the Catholic Church, of the Pope. Now, this was somewhat easy for Charlemagne because, like I said, he was friendly with the Pope. He was a devout Catholic. He wanted to build a Catholic empire throughout Europe. And he was successful in doing this because there was basically no one to stop him, right? So Charlemagne's main opponent in Europe were not Muslim forces because his grandfather Charles Martel took care of that. Instead, Charlemagne's main military and religious opponent in Europe were a group of people called the Saxons. So the Saxons were pagans. They had a lot of Viking influence. So Vikings, as you may or may not know, were pagan peoples. They were warrior peoples from Northern Europe. And so the Saxons were pagan. Charles Martel was Christian. Charles Martel would use his armies. He would go to war against the Saxons, and when he would win the battles, he would require the defeated Saxons to make a choice: either convert or die, right? So either take a Christian baptism and become a Christian, reject the pagan Saxon religion, or they could be killed. That was the choice he gave them. Now, quick note, if somebody really had the choice between being baptized or being killed, the Catholic Church would not recognize that as a valid baptism, because you can't be forced into a baptism, right? So it leads to an interesting question as to whether or not what Charlemagne actually did really converted these peoples to Christianity, right? I mean, from their perspective, they might have thought, oh, he's just going to splash some water on my head, make some prayers to their God, and then I get to live, right? So a lot of people probably thought, oh, yeah, sure, I'll get baptized, but they didn't really think anything about it. So, yeah, that's just a quick relevant side note. Charlemagne also led attacks against Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. So this is in southern Europe around Spain. Remember, I said Charles Martel got rid of Muslims in Europe except for Spain. And Charlemagne never defeated these Muslim forces, but by waging war against Muslims in the south of Europe, in North Africa and in Spain and places like that, he gained a lot of popularity. And he gained a lot of power by doing this. Charlemagne was also someone who promoted Latin and Greek. He was a big supporter of the Roman law, the Code of Justinian. He studied history. He was very interested in education. So, yeah, he wanted to basically copy a lot of what the Roman Empire was doing. Now, even though Charlemagne admired the Roman Empire, he did three things that was very different from the way Roman governance worked. And it looks like two of them got cut off. So I'll go through all three. Number one, Charlemagne did not divide his government up into different provinces like the Romans do. He tried to rule his empire directly, right? So he would ride on horseback all over the entire empire. Now, one reason he was able to do this is because his empire in Europe was a lot smaller than the Roman Empire, which went all the way from Europe to like the east coast, the easternmost coast of China, right? That's thousands and thousands of miles. Europe is much smaller than that. He also depended on nobles instead of a professional army. And the third thing he did is he depended on the Catholic Church and the Pope to support his rule. So those are the three things he did. He tried to rule his empire directly by being physically present in as many corners of the empire as he could. Number two, he didn't have a gigantic professional army like Rome had. He did have an army, but he mostly relied on nobles to supply soldiers for different battles that he wanted. And number three, he relied on the support of the Catholic Church. So in the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church had been the official religion of Rome for a while, but it wasn't necessary to the Roman government. Charlemagne's government required that the Catholic Church be very powerful, so they relied on the Catholic Church. All right, I'm going to stop there because I'm almost out of time.